I'm going to turn the program over to our first speaker. We're going to hear about clinical trials this evening, and I would like to welcome Dr. Deirdre Cohen, who is an Associate Professor of Medicine and also the Director of the Clinical Trials Program here at Perlmutter Cancer Center. So let's welcome Dr. Cohen.
Thank you. So we can keep this relatively informal given we have a small group here today, so feel free to interrupt me as you wish. So I'm just going to kind of give a broad overview of, entitled the talk, The What, Why, and How of Cancer Clinical Trials. And so this is just the outline of what I'm going to talk about. So what are clinical trials? What can we learn from clinical trials? Why are they important? How are they conducted? What are sort of the nuts and bolts and the steps needed behind the scenes to actually launch a study? Trial development and safety issues. Here's about clinical trials in general and how we specifically deal with those issues at NYU. I'll also touch on patient enrollment timelines and then some barriers to clinical trial enrollment. And finally, just give some really broad highlights of some trials at the center here. So what are clinical trials? So they are research studies that people volunteer to be a part of in order to test new drugs, also new devices, or diagnostic tools, such as screening CAT scans for picking up lung cancer, for example. And so we try to answer scientific questions and find better ways to either prevent, diagnose, or treat cancer. And all new treatments must go through clinical trial process, which I'm not sure that everyone is aware of, before being approved by the FDA for regular use. So everything that is now being presented as FDA approved has been through a clinical trial beforehand. So what can we learn from clinical trials? So first off is safety. So is the treatment safe? All treatments come with some risk, so even your standard medicines like Tylenol and aspirin. And clinical trials can help us determine if the benefits of the new intervention outweigh that risk. We also look at efficacy. Does the drug work? How well does it work? Is it better than what is currently approved for this particular disease or indication? Are there fewer side effects than the currently approved medicines? So it might be equally efficacious but has fewer side effects, so that's also beneficial to our patients. And then does it work better for certain people? So if certain people have a particular mutation in their tumor in that population, is this medicine more appropriate for them? So these are all things that we can learn from clinical trials. So why are they important? So certainly I'm sure everyone in this room knows someone or has personally been affected by cancer. There are over nearly 1.8 million new cancer cases expected in 2019. And each year in the United States, more than 500,000 people are expected to die of cancer, with more than, that equals more than 1,600 individuals a day, and out of 4 of the deaths is from cancer. So how do clinical trials play a role in this? So clinical trials can translate results of some of the laboratory findings and basic science research into better ways to prevent, diagnose, and treat cancer. And so the more people that take part, the faster we can then answer very important research questions and ultimately find better treatments and ways to prevent cancer. So what are the types of cancer clinical trials? So there are treatment trials, or what we call intervention trials, where we're giving a medicine to treat a cancer. There are also prevention trials, and there are many types of prevention trials that can be with diet, exercise, and medications. There are other types of trials include early detection trials or screening trials, for example, mammography studies. And then there are diagnostic trials, so looking at new ways to detect cancer. And finally, and something that sometimes may be overlooked, are quality of life studies or supportive care studies, which are also very important in the care of our cancer patients. So how are our clinical trials conducted? So NYU participates in all phases of clinical trials, nationally and internationally. And just to give you sort of a timeline of how studies move along in the process and in the timeline it takes. So it starts in the lab generally with observations by our scientists. And so that can take several years of investigation. And then it goes into phase 1 studies. And phase 1 studies are dose finding and safety studies. And this can take months to years, where drugs are initially tested in humans and looked for safety before moving on to the next phase, a phase 2 portion where we look for hints of efficacy. Does this drug work? We've now found a dose that is safe, and is this drug effective in what we intend to treat? And then finally, phase 3, that is where we are comparing the intervention to the standard of care and seeing if it's either non-inferior or superior, so a better treatment. And this can take years to decades. And finally, phase 4, where we're looking at an approved drug after market and looking for additional safety signals. But what you can see here really is the number of patients that are generally in each phase of a study and the timeline. So it takes a long time to get a drug approved. So just a little delving more specifically into this. So preclinical phase, typically when we're looking at ideas in the lab and bringing them into the clinic, into humans, it takes about, on average, 6 years. So scientists study diseases to test drugs on human cells or in animals. Once something is promising, then in the phase 1 testing, we look at how does the agent affect the human body and what dosage is safe. And then phase 2, as I had mentioned before, does the agent or intervention have an effect on the cancer? And finally, in phase 3, is the new agent or intervention or new use of a treatment better than what is already standard of care? So typically this whole process takes about 8 years, minimum. And finally, phase 4, so as I said, this is when a intervention or drug is already FDA approved, and it's looking at marketing and expansion to larger populations, so the general population, not a study-specific population, and looking at ongoing safety and effectiveness in this setting, the real world, essentially. So now turning to some terminology, because I know some of the terms can be confusing. So what is randomization? So essentially it's so participants have an equal chance to be assigned to one of 2 or more groups. It can be, some studies have, two arms, two potential treatment arms, 3 arms, 4 arms, but when we are randomizing them, there's typically an equal chance of being in any one of those arms. And typically one gets the most widely accepted treatment, the standard treatment, that is one of the arms, and the other arm gets the new treatment being tested, or new treatments being tested, which researchers hope and believe will be better than what is standard. And so here's just a little pictorial that most of the randomization is computer generated, and so we take the information about patients and we have the randomization done by the computer, and one group would get the investigational intervention and the other would receive the standards. So another term is placebo. So what is a placebo? So it's an inactive drug or treatment which is used in a clinical trial. It's sometimes people refer to it as a sugar pill or a saltwater infusion, if you will. And so a placebo-controlled trial compares a new treatment with a placebo. and is usually combined with standard treatment in most cancer clinical trials. So you don't typically get a placebo on its own in the majority of cancer clinical trials, but sometimes there is. People who receive a placebo are in what we call the control group, the standard group, and when a placebo is used in a study, it is done with the full knowledge that you may be assigned to the placebo. You don't necessarily always know that you are in the placebo arm, and I'll go through what the terminology of blinding is, but certainly when you consent to a placebo study, you know that there's a possibility that you could receive a placebo, so that is fully disclosed. So this leads me into the discussion of blinding. So in blinded trials, what that means is one or more parties in the study are kept unaware of which treatment arms the participants have been assigned to. So you don't know which treatment was received. So you may not know whether or not you're getting a placebo, but you do know that there was a possibility you've gotten it. So that would be a at least single blinded study where perhaps the investigator knows, but the patient doesn't know, or vice versa. And this is done in order to prevent bias in the design of the study, so that typically a study is double-blinded, so neither the investigator nor the patient knows whether they're on the placebo or on the investigational agent, and this prevents bias, so we don't alter the study outcomes by our whether we are thinking the drug is going to work or not. So another terminology I wanted to go review is prevention trials. So prevention trials looking at the effectiveness of ways to reduce the risk of cancer. And it's a little different than an interventional treatment trial of cancer patients, where it's really enrolling healthy people who are at high risk of developing cancer. And there are two types. There's action studies, so you're doing something, so exercise is a common example, or agent study, so taking something such as an aspirin or a vitamin, and so that's known as a chemoprevention study. So now to talk about some of the other terminology in terms of how we organize clinical trials. So clinical trials are based on a protocol, which is really a blueprint for how we're going to conduct the study. And it is written with strict scientific guidelines. So the things that must be included in a protocol include the purpose of the study, how many participants will be in the study, who's eligible. So, would you have already had treatment before? What types of treatment would you have had before? Certain specific issues with blood counts are very common in terms of eligibility criteria. It also specifies how the study will be carried out. How often does the participant have to come to the clinic? How many blood draws? How often do you get imaged? Those sorts of things are outlined well ahead of time in the protocol. And then what information will be gathered about participants in terms of outcomes. Do we want to know about how the tumor grows and what changes happen in the blood and what changes happen in the tumor tissue if there are repeat biopsies? So these are all written into the protocol. And finally, of course, endpoints, and most common endpoints include of course, overall survival, response rates, disease-free survival. Those are common cancer clinical trial endpoints. So the informed consent. This is a very important document that is presented to every patient who enrolls on a clinical trial, and it outlines, first and foremost, what will be done to the participant, how the protocol works, so explaining essentially what's written in the protocol in a bit of a condensed form, what risks or discomforts could be experienced while on the study, of course the potential benefits of the treatment, and a very important part is the fact that it's a voluntary decision and that alternatives to this study are presented within the consenting process. So these are all very important features of every consent form that is given to our patients. So why should anyone participate in a clinical trial? I know there's a lot of potential concern and suspicion and maybe even distrust often in participating in a clinical trial when people hear about them. And so I think some of the very important reasons to participate are listed here, including access to new medicines or technologies. So this is often a way to get some groundbreaking treatment that would not otherwise be available outside of a study situation. And certainly if the new treatment or intervention is proven to work, then you may benefit be one of the first to benefit in terms of improved health and outcomes from the cancer. And then finally, patients have a chance to help others, so sort of the altruistic piece of participating in a clinical trial and improve overall cancer care. So turning to the risks, because nothing can be all good, right? So what are the possible risks of participating in a study? So certainly not all the new treatments or interventions under study are going to work, right? And not only may they not work, but they may be worse than the standard of care. And so that's an important thing to understand, and that is certainly outlined in each consent form. And then even if a new treatment does work, it may not work in everyone. So not every individual will derive benefit, even though overall the study may show benefit to the group. And finally, most clinical trials, often I should say, lead to more potential frequent visits, blood testing. There may be additional biopsies that would not be standard, and imaging studies that may be more frequent than on a standard intervention. So these are all things to take into consider when one is looking at participation in a study. So what are how are trials developed? What are the steps that we take to get a study ultimately into the clinic with our patients? So I want to highlight the fact that there are multiple steps, and really they're very much there to ensure safety. So the first piece of the process is something called the DMG review and approval process, and the DMG stands for Disease Management Group. So we have about at least 10 separate disease management groups, including breast, thoracic, gastrointestinal, etc. And these groups review the feasibility of every study that's brought forward. And it's a group of peers that includes surgeons, radiation oncologists, medical oncologists, and our research staff. And we say, is the study medically relevant for this disease management group? And does it benefit the patient population that we're treating? Okay, and can we feasibly do this? Does it fit in do we have all the tools to conduct this study? It next goes to another committee called the PRMC Review and Approval Committee. So that's the Protocol Review and Monitoring Committee. And this is really a scientific review committee. And there are many people who sit on this committee. It's a committee of peers, including biostatisticians, pharmacy, all different types of doctors, medical oncologists, radiation oncologists, surgeons, who all look at the study from a scientific perspective. Does this make sense? What are the data that backs up the reason why we think this intervention may be helpful for our patients? And so, studies are either approved, deferred because of various issues, or moved on and passed on because there is not sufficient evidence to say this is something we should carry forward at NYU. Yeah.
So what I'm curious about, and I don't see in this slide, what's the role of the government, National Institutes of Health? Are they somewhere in this process?
Yes, well, not at this process. So they are a level up, and I believe Dr. Novick is going to talk a little bit about.
We'll talk about government.
Yeah, that. So I'm kind of giving a broad overview, but she's going to drill down on that. So after it's looked at from a scientific standpoint, it goes to our Institutional Review Board, our IRB. And so this committee really looks at the benefits, the risks, the population inclusion, informed consent. So it's really looking at a fine-tooth comb from a patient perspective and the patient rights perspective. And is all of the interventions, are they needed? Are they equitable? Does it make sense from that standpoint? And finally, the Data Safety and Monitoring Committee. So this is a committee, again, of multiple different individuals where they look at various time points that are pre-specified within the protocol, side effects, and looks for safety. So there's another layer of safety that's looking, once the study is ongoing, it's monitoring every patient's progress and looking for safety signals where there would be something concerning, where there would need to be a hold on the study. So this is just sort of a little bit of an outline of the timeline. So in terms of actually putting a patient on a study. So initially a patient case is reviewed by, we get a call and someone's coming in as a new patient visit. And so we look through the records, and this is it's reviewed by the research team and presented to the oncologist. As maybe a potential patient for a study. The case is reviewed by our physicians and the team members, and we look at eligibility and the risk benefit to the patient. We set up an appointment to discuss the study, and if a patient is interested, we would then go through the informed consent. And once the informed consent is signed, then the process of screening goes on. So this is a period generally of about 4 weeks where the patient undergoes various testing per the study protocol, the blueprint of the study, to determine if the patient does meet all of those criteria and is in fact truly eligible. And then the patient is officially enrolled. And if it's a randomized study, that's the time when the patient is randomized and assigned an arm of treatment. Treatment is conducted, and then finally at the end of treatment, the patient does complete an off-treatment assessment typically. So why do trials take so long? So there's many barriers to clinical trial enrollment. And what is really unfortunate from a cancer center perspective is that less than 5% of adults participate in clinical trials, whereas in pediatrics the rate is much higher, and they've made much more advances because of the high rate of clinical trial enrollment. In order to find new treatments, we need to test them within the context of clinical trials, but if we don't have patients enrolling, it stagnates the progress. So what are some of the barriers? Many people don't know about clinical trials, but that's not you guys, because you're here and learning about them, so that's great. So there's poor advertisement and outreach about clinical trials. There's also a great deal of issues with language and cultural barriers in terms of enrollment. And minority and female participation are very low generally across clinical trials. Other issues include many patients don't have access to trials. In rural areas, there are not as many opportunities for clinical trials, although that is changing. And then many individuals may be afraid or suspicious of research. They're sort of like the guinea pig. We're testing things out. And they're not necessarily aware of all of the steps that I've just discussed regarding the scientific rigor that's involved in clinical trials and the many safety layers that are built into studies. They worry of being harmed by an unproven treatment. And then the stringent eligibility criteria. So many of the protocols require very specific criteria for our patients to enter, and many patients don't meet those specifications. Some patients are certainly concerned about cost, the financial toxicity, and they may not want to go against a physician's wishes and leave one individual caretaker to go to a different institution or provider for a clinical trial. So that is some of the issues. There are certainly many more. So here's just a nice kind of pictorial of what are the potential barriers so to enrollment in clinical trials. So there's structural issues in terms of, as I said, the clinic access. You know, is there a clinical trial that's even available in your community? And then the next thing is eligibility, which I discussed. So, you know, there's been a push nationally through the NCI and other organizations to really loosen eligibility criteria to make it more real world, because at the end of the day, that's who we're treating, the real world population. And so should eligibility criteria be so stringent so that we only are able to enroll a certain sector of the population with a certain disease. The other barrier is the attitudes, so physician attitudes. So, you know, it does, some physicians have inherent bias. You know, they are sure this is not going to work, so they don't want to offer it to their patients. They don't have equipoise, all right? The other issue is that it takes a lot longer a lot more time and effort for a physician to sit down and speak with a patient about a clinical trial. And so it's a lot more effort and time to walk through those studies. And certainly in a busy day, some physicians find it challenging to stop and have a discussion about clinical trials. On the flip side, there's also the patient attitude in terms of, as we said, the suspicion and other issues in terms of cost and added procedures that may not be appealing to that individual. So I thought I'd go through some common myths and misconceptions of clinical trials. So one of the common myths is that health insurance won't cover the costs of a clinical trial. And that's certainly a big concern to many patients that I meet with. And so the fact is that federal law does require that most health insurances cover routine sort of standard of care costs within the clinical trial and under certain conditions. And so certainly the patient has to be eligible for the trial. The trial has to be approved by the federal government. It does not involve out-of-network doctors or hospitals. In general, if a patient does join an approved clinical trial, then most health insurances cannot refuse to let them take part or limit their benefits. So I think that's an important thing to know. And typically, all of the non-standard of care interventions are provided by the study. So another myth is that informed consent is meant primarily to protect the legal interests of the researchers or the doctors, investigators, etc. And so that is nothing farther than the truth. Really, the only purpose or the primary purpose of the informed consent is to protect the participants in the trial by giving information that can help the participants make an informed decision and understand whether it's right for them to take part in the research. And it also makes the individual aware of the rights within the study, so it's really important to understand. Another myth on a clinical trial, I'm going to get a placebo. So placebos are rarely used in cancer clinical trials. If they are used, it's most often when they're combined with a standard of care, or there is no standard of care, and the standard of care is supportive or palliative care. And in those cases, there may be a placebo in that instance. But typically, studies are either placebos combined with standard of care or given in the face of where there is no accepted standard of care. This is a very common myth I see in my own clinic, is that clinical trials are last-ditch efforts. I don't want to go on that. That means there's nothing left for me. And so that's nothing farther than the truth. There are clinical trials for every stage. As I mentioned, there are prevention studies, so patients don't even have a diagnosis of cancer, but this is to prevent it. And so I think that's really important to understand, and that the clinical trials can allow access to therapies that are, new and up and coming and not otherwise available. So another myth: once I enroll, I'm locked into this trial. That's it. I gotta stay in for the whole time, and I can't get out even if I'm experiencing bad side effects, or I'm sick of coming in once a week, or whatever the reason is. So no, that's not true. You are in control always on a clinical trial. That's the patient first. If you decide you don't want to participate in the trial anymore at any time, you withdraw, no questions asked. And we do want to do safety assessments, certainly, but at any time, the clinical trial ends with the patient telling us. I won't have access to the experimental treatment once a clinical trial ends, even if it's working. So that really depends on the therapy that's being studied, but in many cases, trials are set up to continue the treatment as long as the patient is benefiting from it. And in some cases, we are able to allow patients to stay on in exceptional cases when they're deriving benefits. So that typically is not an issue. In general, right, the only time that a drug would be withdrawn from a patient, even if it were working, would be if there were toxic side effects or other safety issues that developed in other patients that required us to stop the medicine. So in general, this is not an issue that we face in terms of taking away a drug that's safe and effective, even though the study has been completed. So what's happening here at Perlmutter Cancer Center? So right now we have over 120 cancer clinical trials open and available to our patients across every disease indication, and it continues to grow. These studies are available here at NYU Perlmutter Cancer Center, as well as Bellevue Hospital, Lake Success on Long Island, and they are about to, in the next month or two, open at NYU Winthrop in Long Island, and soon at NYU Brooklyn and the Veterans Hospital in Manhattan. I think important resources for clinical trials that everyone should know about are can be found at clinicaltrials.gov, and then of course the NYU Langone website, where if you just search for clinical trials, you can see a listing of all of the clinical trials, and you can do more specific searching depending on the cancer type that you're interested in. And of course, the most important not important, but helpful reference, I would hope, is your physician. So it's important, to ask your doctor about clinical trials and really push him or her about opportunities. They may not be right for you, but you need to know what's available to make that decision. And with that, I'm gonna stop and see if there are any questions that I can answer before I turn it over to Dr. Novick.